My guest today is Luba Vengelova, the founder of The Hub, a part-time online microschool for homeschooled adolescents that emphasizes curiosity, collaboration, and community. Meeting 2 half days a week in small groups led by skilled facilitators. Participants ages 10 to 16 work together on interdisciplinary activities and projects that they have a hand in choosing. Luba, welcome to the Liberated podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
It is so great to have you here. We've known each other for a number of years now, started working together years ago on a program called Alternatives to School, which sort of evolved into the Alliance for Self-Directed Education. And it was just really interesting to kind of see this evolution of alternative education over the past several years. And I definitely want to spend most of today talking about your experience in alternative education as a parent and as a founder. But before we get to that, I think it's really helpful to kind of start with your backstory as someone who has degrees in systems engineering and journalism. You worked as a computer programmer for a Fortune 500 company and in marketing and communications, including running your own communications consulting companies. How did you, I guess, what was that early stage like in your kind of professional career? And how did you end up in the world of education ultimately?
Yeah, so like I said, I've had two kind of very different career paths, one in software development, and then I got a master's in journalism and went down the journalism path, which led to public relations and communications consulting. And as is the case, I think, with many founders, what led me to the world of education is having a child and things, the conventional path not really turning out to be what one really had, hoped for. And so I actually started writing. I wrote an op-ed, is what got me kind of started after going to a community meeting about schools in Washington, D.C. And so I wrote an op-ed, which led to an invitation to write all these other education articles. And in the meantime, I was kind of doing my own research for our daughter and looking at different, at first, just different institutional settings, public, private, charter, all that. And then we noticed that she was actually learning a lot just informally by being with other children and other, adults, various adults. So we went down the homeschool route. I read Peter Gray's book, Free to Learn, which, opened my eyes and helped me intellectually understand what I was observing, in person. And so, yeah, so kind of all of that kind of came together, the personal and the professional. I started writing a lot about education, worked, as you said, with you and Peter Gray and others on the precursor to the self-directed organization, the Alliance. And then, at first our focus was on in-person homeschool co-ops and groups. And then I noticed at a certain age, once the kids got to their tween years, it just became much more challenging to do in-person things together because interests were diverging and so on. And schedules became more complicated. And that's what led me to then kind of come up with a different option, which led to the hub. And I can go into more detail on that, or if you want.
Yeah. Well, so let's talk a little bit about the hub because you were homeschooling your daughter and kind of engaging in the homeschooling community and co-ops in Washington, D.C. And you were, if I recall correctly, about to open sort of an in-person microschool for the
Right.
hub that was going to,
Yeah.
again, focus on curiosity, collaboration, community for
Yes.
homeschoolers right when COVID hit. Is that
Right.
right? Like it couldn't
Exactly.
have been more a more difficult time to open an in-person learning
It
community, right?
it was it kind of derailed a lot of the research and development I'd been doing over the previous year and a half. And I mean, we had been running homeschool groups. Some of them actually were, I mean, the term microschool was just not really in circulation back then, but they were basically microschools. They were sort of hybrid homeschool
Hmm.
microschools because they relied on both parents and paid facilitators. And so we were already kind of doing the microschool thing before it became a thing. And yes, the original plan was for the hub to be an in-person hub that would offer families a whole range of things from, a 5-day a week microschool experience to kind of a la carte one-off things so that kids, past their childhood years, so getting into the tween years and beyond, could still kind of do things together, um, even while making space for them to do things on their own as well. So kind of trying to have the best of both worlds where they would have time if they wish to do, follow their own interests through, various a la carte things, and also to have together time that would be interdisciplinary and facilitated together and have it all be in one space.
Yeah, and that
And
was set to open right in fall of 2020 to fall of 2020, excuse me. So
yeah,
what
yeah.
happened?
So I had already started looking at space. I had identified a space that I was kind of planning to rent and kind of start off with a 3-day a week part-time in-person microschool. And then yes, everything shut down. And so I just first was kind of reeling for, a month or two or three, and trying to figure out, okay, what do I do now? What does the future look like? Are things going to reopen? If so, when? And it was clear that nothing was going to revert back very soon. So I decided to make the leap to doing things online. But I was reading a lot of parenting and education forums and the experiences of families with schools that had, just made the transition to online, and all the, criticisms and complaining and everything. It just, about how unsatisfying it was and so on. So I realized pretty quickly from all of that you couldn't just, take what we had planned to do in person and then start doing it online. That wasn't going to work. And we did a couple of just pilot summer camps that summer to test out a couple of different formats. And then I also consulted with people on my advisory council, including Dr. Yang Zhao, who had done research on, what are best practices in online learning. And so we completely revised the format to basically to take advantage of the online space and to do things for which it was well suited rather than trying to artificially do things online that were actually best suited to doing in person. So yes, so we started in fall of 2020 with basically very similar format to what we have now, 2 days a week. We actually started off meeting 3.5 hours per session, so a total of 7 hours per week. But it was unanimously requested that we make it longer. That didn't actually feel long enough for the kids.
Mm.
And which is, it's interesting because that's one of the questions I often get from parents. They're like, wow, that sounds like an awfully long time to be together at one stretch. Um, I think because people picture, you know, online looking a certain way, but we do it very differently. So, if anything, the kids actually want it to be longer still. And so we started letting the older kids stay even beyond the 4 hours. But we found 4 hours is kind of a reasonable amount of time. And and the reason being that it lets um, relationships develop. It lets everyone just go deeper in every sense, like in terms of exploring topics and themes, and also just in terms of making space for relationships to really develop in a sense of community, which is just very, very difficult to get if people are just meeting, let's say, for 1 hour a week. It's just a completely different thing. And if they're trying to get through a curriculum, whereas we have 4 hours twice a week and no curriculum.
Mm.
So it's just a very different experience. It's more of the kind of flow state.
Yeah, I love that. I want to hear a little bit more about how those hours are spent. But when you shifted to online, did you think it was going to be a temporary solution? I mean, were you still thinking at
I
some
did.
point you're going to open in person again? And kind of when did you realize, no, this online thing is actually
Yeah.
the right model for us?
So, yes, I did expect it to be just temporary for maybe a year.
Mm.
And I think what sold me on continuing down the online path is there were actual tears shed by everyone on the last day of the term, the winter term and the spring term, especially the spring term, because there would be a long summer break coming. And, the kids didn't want it to end. And, just what the feedback we got from the kids and the parents was just so positive. And I realized, this is actually working really well, and it eliminates a lot of complexity, of course, versus doing it in person. You don't have to have a space, and participants can be located anywhere. I mean,
Yeah.
it's just got the convenience factor also. And facilitators can be anywhere. So yes, I went from originally anticipating that it would be a temporary thing, and the original kids were all in the Mid-Atlantic, well, actually in the DC area originally. And then within a year, we had kids in different countries, not just in different, you know, parts of the US, but in different countries and so on. So it became something quite, different and bigger than I had originally dared to hope.
Oh, I love it. So today, how many students are you serving? I know it's ages 10 to 16. About how many are in the hub?
So let's see, we've got about, I think it's 17 currently.
Okay.
Um, and that's across 3 cohorts. And yes, we're planning to add more in 2025.
And so, what are you finding are some of the major reasons why families, learners are coming to the hub? Are they folks who've always been homeschooled and are kind of looking for adolescent community? Are they new to homeschooling? I guess what is their motivation for joining the hub community?
So it's interesting. We find that parents have somewhat different motivations, but the one that I think they all share is that, for the most part, they're established homeschoolers.
Mhm.
I mean, we have had some kids who have come from school, but in most cases, they had homeschooled at some point in the past, so it wasn't a completely new thing for them. Um, so, for the most part, like the parents feel that they have the basics covered with homeschooling in whatever way they choose to do that. I mean, it's quite interesting. We have parents doing everything from unschooling to following a curriculum. Um, but they do that on their own time, so they're free to, do it however, whatever works for them. And but they come to us because they feel that something important is missing. The kind of shared learning experience with a consistent group of peers, which, becomes like just really important for children at these ages. And so in many cases, they're kind of wondering, how can we continue homeschooling and meet this need? Because, of course, I mean, the homeschooling ecosystem has exploded. There are a ton of online, um, you know, classes, programs, and in person, not just online, of course. But it's really challenging to actually have the consistent cohort experience, which is a whole different ball game than, getting to like, as one parent once put it, socialization is actually not hard. It's pretty easy, but kind of deeper connection and community and feeling a sense of belonging, that part is hard to get, and for parents to facilitate that for their children when they're homeschooling. Because, like I said, just meeting a group of kids once a week for, let's say, an hour, and then it's a slightly different group of kids, 6 weeks or 8 weeks later because the term, is over and now it's different kids and so on. And especially if those classes or programs or whatever are following a curriculum of sorts, there isn't often much room to actually kind of just get to talking with, other people, and for conversations to flow organically and to get to know people at a deeper level. And so that's the niche that we fill.
So how does it work then, Luba? How are these 4 hours twice a week spent for these adolescents?
Sure. Um, so it's divided up into four time blocks, and there are breaks in between. And we, we're fine with kids also, getting up and getting a snack or whatever, taking care of their physical needs as needed during those 4 hours. They don't have to be, just sitting there at their computer the, entire 4 hours
Hmm.
nonstop. And so the first hour, and it can look a little bit different from cohort to cohort because, group dynamics are different depending on individuals. And so it's up to each group to kind of come up with the exact flow that works for them. But let's just take kind of an example.
Hmm.
So let's say the first time block, so 45 minutes and then a 15-minute break, is spent just talking about, whatever comes up organically, like, maybe things they've been doing since the last meeting. Maybe someone's read some interesting things. A facilitator might kind of pose some questions to get them thinking about certain things. Just kind of informal, organic conversation, and talking about what the rest of the day's schedule will be also, and deciding amongst themselves, the facilitators and the participants jointly deciding, what activities or projects will be done within each of the next 3 time blocks for that
Hmm.
day. Um, and so then maybe the next time block after the break will be spent on whatever activity they may have chosen to do during that time, which can range from anything from having discussions, which can be either prompted or unprompted, like prompted with like a question spinner that has different, questions loaded on it, to get, conversation started. Or it can be something like a geography guessing game. It can be working on collaborative storytelling. It can be collaborative art. It can be, coming up with quizzes for each other on topics of interest that they've been, learning about on their own and they want to share. Or it can be one of the participants doing essentially a show and tell on something that interests them, such as music theory. They're really, I was going to say jazzed, no pun intended, about the topic, and they really want to, share. And so they do kind of a little workshop or something, for whoever wants to listen to that. Or it might be an occasional guest speaker or even a virtual field trip, all sorts. Basically, it's wide open. And it depends on what they're curious about in that particular group at that particular time, and what their interests are and so on. Then let's say the second session might be working on a group project that they've chosen to do that term. There's always a group project and a presentation to family and friends at the end of the term. And so that can last for months. And, they may be working on that. And so that can be whatever, again, whatever they've chosen. It can be producing an e-zine or a series of e-zines, producing a video, creating imaginary worlds that incorporate all sorts of, thinking about, what kind of governance the different entities in this world have, what their languages are, what the geology of the world is, what cultural symbols they have, like on flags and so on. So it can, the biology of like the different life forms that exist in this world and so on. Or it can be producing a book of collaborative short stories with original art. It can be, anything that makes sense in that time period and for people to do online as a group. And then the fourth period might be, another activity of the sort that, I gave examples for earlier. And other activities might be like, puzzles and challenges and talking about like moral dilemmas, like, the trolley problem. And
Mm.
um, it can be, anything that anyone, either the facilitators who always have ideas in their back pocket and like a whole list of things that they can suggest if, people are kind of not coming up with inspiration, or that the participants suggest. And if not everyone wants to do the same thing, they can get into breakout rooms. And if cohorts are meeting concurrently, we can have kind of interaction among the cohorts in breakout rooms and facilitators and so on.
Yeah, I really love this idea of this online microschool. This sounds so similar to the self-directed learning center that my homeschooled kids attended pre-COVID, a microschool where they went a couple of days a week in person and did exactly what you're talking about in an online setting, where they were, able to select classes that were offered. Everything was optional, but it was very much, learner driven, with the community itself sort of deciding what classes might be interesting to do and kind of have that cadence. So you're replicating that in an online model, which I think is really neat. And certainly, as you said, more far reaching. You're able to bring together young people from all over the country and all over the world in this sort of shared, community and learning experience. And so, there might be some people thinking, well, how can you really build community online, right? Like, how is this really going to satisfy my homeschooled teens' desire for peer interaction and sort of a social life? And what do you say to that?
So the hub isn't designed to be the sole social outlet for children. I mean, I think most of the children at the hub do also, have other social things going on. It's not their only thing. Although I think um, for I know at least temporarily for some, it may be the only thing because they may be either living in a more remote location
Mm.
temporarily or traveling. Like we have some people who are world schooling, and so they're kind of going along as a family unit, but without regular interaction with other people online in person. But other kids at the hub, for the most part, live in kind of major metro areas, a lot of them, and are doing other things. So it's not their only social outlet. But absolutely, I mean, the kids have um, made, I would say very kind of important, deep connections. And I, the reason is, I think that they can is because I think of building community as requiring time, enough time together and doing shared activities, and also a culture that kind of that values it. And we absolutely encourage it. We're not trying to stop kids from talking so that we got to get back to what we're supposed to do today. Um, we, if they're talking, we kind of build off of that and kind of see where, like, I mean, just as an example, a lot of the learning at the hub is very organic. So for instance, like they may start out talking about Thanksgiving, and let's say like a month ago or a little over a month ago, one of the facilitators is Canadian and mentioned that, oh, well, Canadian Thanksgiving is coming up. And that, brought up the question, well, why do Canadians have Thanksgiving, at a different time of year? And it wasn't like, okay, well, yeah, that's an interesting question, but now we got to get back to what we're doing. It was like, oh, well, let's look into that.
Mhm.
And let's find out that it's because the climate is different there and the harvest comes sooner. And well, what are their Thanksgiving traditions? And, we build that time and space and intention for those things to happen. And and for the kind of more organic, free-flowing conversations. And for it allows the facilitators and the kids to get to know each other better as people. And when they're trying to decide, what activities and projects to do, they get to know about each other's interests. And they're bringing in things about what they're doing in their lives outside of the hub. Like, for instance, one family is actually sailing around the Mediterranean
Mm.
right now. And so, those kids are talking about, the sailboat and how sailing works and, different ports that, they're visiting and so on. And someone else lives, on an island in Maine and is, talking about, what it's like up there. And so kind of um, what they each are experiencing as their daily lives is actually becoming part of the learning. And it's helping build, relationships and community. I mean, uh, a number of the kids have been there for years. Like, uh, I, the majority of the kids actually in our original cohort have been there for years.
Mm.
And so, like, it's fascinating to see how a culture develops. They have their inside jokes. They have, kind of recurring things they bring up. And all of that, we make space for that. We make
Okay.
space for that because one of our intentions is to build community. So we are very intentional at letting it build rather than, kind of not making space for it. So it's a very intentional thing. And I would say it, and the kids also can communicate with each other outside of hub sessions through our communications platform. So they're not limited to only talking to each other during those 8 hours. They can also
Right.
communicate asynchronously as well.
It sounds like such a great resource for young people, homeschoolers who are looking to complement their kind of in-person social life and their in-person community with this consistent online community of sort of like-minded peers.
Right.
So I'm just so glad that you built this and look forward to seeing where it goes in the coming years. But I'd love to hear, Luba, what is your impression of being an education entrepreneur? How does it compare to your work as an entrepreneur running a communications consulting business or some of the other entrepreneurial endeavors that you had? How is it the same and or different from that?
Um, well, I mean, especially if your own child is involved. I mean, you're
Mm,
super motivated to make it a really, really stellar experience. I mean, there's no greater skin in the game, really, than, wanting it to work well for your child. And, your child's needs aren't unique. You can at the same time meet other children's needs as well. So there's that. I mean, there's just that extra level of motivation there. And other than that, I mean, it's when it's something so different than most models that exist out there. I mean, the hub is just very different in, being this kind of 8 hours a week thing online, interdisciplinary, and the kids and facilitators jointly, deciding things and
Mm.
so on. And so there's a lot to figure out. We've um, had a lot of, I mean, it's much less formulaic, and like there's no path that's been that you can really copy um, and follow rather. So you can kind of have to take things from here and there and kind of forge your own path and figure things out, and just make sure to regularly get feedback from the kids, from the parents, from the facilitators, and kind of triangulate and figure out, the best path forward, and how to tweak this or that. Like, for instance, one term, we had thought that having 10 kids would be okay. So each cohort has two facilitators, and we thought 10 kids, two facilitators, that should be manageable, because the original cohort had continued growing. But after doing that for one term, we realized that required just a lot of time managing and making decisions in order to allow everyone to have a voice.
Mm.
And so much time was spent on the process, preceding activities and projects, that it really took a little too much away from the actual activities and projects. So we kind of dialed that down, and now our maximum is 8 children per cohort with two facilitators.
Mm.
Um, and so other kind of little minor adjustments like that, we've made over the years, and we've pretty much, kind of had to figure a lot of that out. Plus, me talking to people on our advisory council and others who have somewhat similar experiences, but not entirely the same, and kind of just taking that all on board, and very much making it a team effort.
Yeah, and I just love your point about how, it's sort of unlike any other business, right? So, some of the challenges and the experiences might be similar to your previous entrepreneurial endeavors, but so much is different because the model is so different. And then, of course, you had a pandemic thrown in there and had to
Yeah.
pivot to an entirely new delivery model. All of this just showing sort of the resilience and agility of today's entrepreneurs, people like you. This is what separates you from the rest of us, right? Is your just ability to tackle these challenges head on and persevere in light of these challenges. So kudos to you for all of
Thank you.
that. So what's next for the hub? Where do you see this going over the coming years?
So I anticipate adding more cohorts. So we were fortunate enough to get a Vela Education Fund grant this year that allowed us to work with marketing consultants to kind of take a step back and take a look at who are ideal target audiences, how to explain things to them. It's very challenging to succinctly and clearly explain something that is really multidimensional, because
Mhm.
it's I mean, our three goals are the expanding intellectual horizons, developing life skills such as teamwork and critical thinking and um, creativity and so on, and the consistent community. And to communicate that succinctly is a challenge. So anyway, we've been doing a lot of work kind of looking at how to explain what we do, and refining our website, and so on. So kind of laying a foundation, a solid foundation for additional growth. And then I don't, my intention is not to just keep growing and growing and growing, because I don't think that would, I think there's a certain point beyond which it would make sense for a separate hub to kind of break off and someone else to lead, you know,
Hmm.
um, and so on. That's my vision, is to kind
Yeah.
of grow it similar to the way we found that 10 kids and two facilitators just felt like too much. And it's often hard to know where that line is until you've crossed it sometimes, but hopefully not crossed it too much that, you can't easily just take a half step back or whatever. Um, so that's my plan is to grow it, but not too much, but to ideally then help other people also kind of create their own hubs in their own way. I mean, they
Yeah.
might want to do some things a little differently, and that's fine.
Yeah, and do you imagine that growth, would how would that work from your kind of scalable model? Would it be like a franchise model, like a licensing model? Do you see it sort of a different strategy altogether? Will the branding be the same or different? What are you thinking about?
So those are all great questions, and I have not made any decisions
Hmm.
or yet. I mean, I've thought about these things, but I don't know. I think when I get to that point where I feel like, it's time to kind of focus more on helping others set up things, that's when I'll have more in-depth conversations to figure out exactly those things.
Yeah. And so, I'm sure many of my listeners and viewers are really intrigued by what you're building and might have young people who would be interested in this model. So they would go to the hub.community. And then what would happen next? Would there be sort of some trial period without them having to sort of jump into this new community? I mean, I guess what would be sort of those initial steps for a prospective family?
Sure. So we're very intentional about, or we try to be very intentional about everything. And one of them is to try to bring in families for whom the hub is a good fit and vice versa, in order to maintain, good group dynamics. So we want to make sure that it's a good fit. And the way we do that is we have periodic open houses that feature a little sample mini session
Hmm.
for kids, or alternatively, we meet one on one with the child and the parent and kind of try and gauge that way, what the fit would be. And then we do have a 1 month, basically satisfaction guarantee period, um, that, if the fit turns out not to be right for any reason, there's no additional commitment beyond that. Because we certainly don't want people to be there who are, not happy to be there because that doesn't serve our purposes either. So that's how we do it. And, I think that gives people plenty of time to really, get enough of a sense of it without having to necessarily commit for a whole term or a whole year.
Yeah, I think that's so important, just that ability to experiment and not feel locked in, because sometimes, especially for folks who might be new to homeschooling or new to alternative education, the whole process can seem very intimidating. So to be able to have these baby steps to take and kind of test out the waters and see if it's going to work for their child, I think makes a lot of sense and can alleviate some of the intimidation that a family might rightfully feel. So, as we wrap up, Luba, I'd love to just get your sense as someone who's now been in the kind of alternative education space for over a decade, I guess, at this point.
Mhm.
What do you see as sort of the future of alternative education more broadly and innovative programs like yours more specifically?
Well, certainly the availability of options has, just expanded remarkably in the last 4 years, especially.
Mhm.
It's also interesting to me that even with so many more options, I am still hearing the same kind of pain points among at least homeschooling parents. And one of those is, I mean, the what I hear is the academics is easy for the most part. I mean, there's a little trial and error with, which method of homeschooling, for instance, someone might want to do, or um, which particular curriculum, if they're choosing a curriculum, and so on. But for the most part, parents seem to feel capable to at least get through that. It's the together aspect, their kids doing things with other kids that is the challenge for them. But I mean, there are certainly, a lot of options now, in person and online, um, that they can choose among. I mean, a lot of them do have set curricula that they follow, a set curriculum. But of course, there are some that, don't have a curriculum and so on. So it's kind of a matter of just, I mean, there are a lot more choices for parents to choose whatever flavor works for them. If anything, now what I'm hearing is also that there's decision fatigue in
Mhm.
having to wade through a lot of the choices and figure out, how they differ and which one would be suitable for a particular child and so on. But yeah, and for homeschoolers, I mean, yeah, it's interesting. Like, it still seems difficult for a lot of parents to kind of find their tribe of homeschoolers and to get that community experience for their kids, despite the number of homeschoolers having grown so much.
Why do you think that is? Do you have any thoughts?
I do, but I think the culture has changed a lot is part of it. What I'm hearing is that uh, like the concept of flaking out on commitments has become much more acceptable. And so, people, what I'm keep hearing is that, people um, create meetups or whatever, they'll announce a meetup, they'll get responses saying, "Oh, I'm really interested. I'm really interested." And then they show up and almost no one shows up.
Mhm.
Um, there's like the whole, and I'm also hearing, people say that, they go to playgrounds and the parents would just prefer to be on their phones rather than interact with the other parents. Like the culture has just really changed a lot, in a lot of places. And so the kind of the social barrier to people getting together is much higher just in general. It's not just about homeschooling at all. Um, but also in a way, in some ways it was easier with fewer homeschoolers because you could parents could disagree on things, but if you knew that there weren't that many other homeschooling families around, you had to make it work with these homeschooling families
Mhm.
and, create something and work through, differences of opinion, which can take a lot of time and energy. Whereas if in the back of your head you're thinking, oh, there's so many homeschoolers now, okay, well, we've just come up against, a difference of opinion, with these parents. I'll just find other parents, you know, like, but that's not that easy. So it's, I think, kind of a combination of things. It's, I mean, it's fascinating, really. I mean, for someone to do a sociological study would be
Mhm.
very interesting.
In your free time, Luba.
Yeah.
This is so great. I'm excited to see the growth of the hub and the proliferation of more hubs, hopefully, that you help to launch with other leaders across the country and around the world. So the website is thehub.community. How else can my listeners and viewers connect with you, find out more? Do you have preferred social media sites or other areas where folks can find you?
Yes, the hub is on Facebook and Instagram, LinkedIn, and we have a YouTube channel, featuring, quite a lot of videos as well. So we are on all those socials. You can find us there.
Well, I am so glad we had this conversation, Luba, and so excited to see what you're building and continuing to do to promote alternative education models. Luba Vangelova, thank you so much for being on the LiberatED podcast.
Thank you. Nice to be on.